Okay. Hello. What is up, everybody? Welcome. Dorian Sapiens, first one in here. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I'm Damon. And on this channel, we usually talk about intersection between leftist stuff and the Christian tradition and a lot about liberation theology. And so recently I made a video about why Christians should support strikes and why that should just be an obvious thing. And there's a lot of movements for justice that you think would be obvious for Christians, but unfortunately you have to explain that in a whole new way in this generation. And after I made, well, the reason I made it at the time was really because of some of the recent strikes going on, especially the COLA strikes in UC Santa Cruz and then spreading. And then all this stuff started going down. With what's going down with the virus and everything, and now people are talking about a general strike. So when I first made that video, I already hit up laborkyle here and I said we got to talk about this. We got to talk about strikes, and now this happened. Is like, okay, we especially have to talk about it. And so laborkyle, that's like his favorite subject to talk about. So what do you do, Kyle, on YouTube and Twitch and stuff?
Lots of things. I like to make video essays about, like, honestly, Marxist theory in video games is mostly what I talk about. But I'm also a labor organizer and have been in a variety of different contexts. I've been a union member in also a bunch of different contexts. And right now, I'm the branch secretary treasurer of my local branch of the IWW. So we do a great deal of organizing campaigns inside and outside of the typical model that unions use. We work a lot with service industry workers. We, in general, are pushing into the sections of industry that the corporate unions are completely unwilling to actually, like, engage with, because ultimately the corporate unions, what they want is an organizing campaign that they're either not going to lose any money on, that they're going to make money on, or that they can make a sacrifice now in order to help an organizing campaign further down the road. So when you have, I live in Orlando and I'm filled with a city, like I'm in a city filled with like service industry shops between like 25 and 35 employees. And no union will organize these shops. They refuse to. They won't. The United Food and Commercial Workers, they won't do it. SEIU won't do it. AFSCME won't do it. And so we have to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to get service industry workers, like, the things that they actually need in order to move forward? And so, long story short, I'm a grad student, I'm a teacher, and I make videos on the internet, and I organize radical anti-capitalist trade union shops in my city. And that's about it, I would say.
That's awesome. And what's funny is you also have a Christian background, growing up in like a conservative Christian background. And I was thinking, like, as I'm seeing all these different ways that people talk about organizing and solidarity, which we're going to get into plenty of ways, but I realized there are a lot of things, especially when they talk about solidarity and standing for each other and being able to fight for their rights, which are human rights. It feels like I said earlier, this is stuff that Christians should be obviously caring about. But then it feels like they do a better job than Christians ever could. And I think one of the things that gets people to start questioning their conservative Christian environment is when they meet people in completely non-Christian environments who seem to act more Christian than the Christians they know. And so I think some people see that in organizing spaces, and I think some people see that, and even I think just with the concept of solidarity, I think one of the things that blows young Christians' minds is when someone has the concept of solidarity that's deep within them, like kind of like a phronesis thing, where it's practical wisdom deep within them, and you think, wait, so other people who don't get taught these moralizing teachings every single week are like way more moral than a lot of people I know. But but yeah, so tell me a bit about like your experience growing up in the church environment and then going into organizing and stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there's more of a connection between my childhood and my upbringing and my organizing tactics, model, experience, etc., than I think a lot of people would realize. And it's something I talk
Hmm.
about very, very openly because I think it's useful. I grew up in a very loving, working class, very, very Christian conservative evangelical family who I love dearly, who I have a fantastic relationship with now. But the church that I grew up in was um, not so great insofar as that it stemmed from the denomination I grew up in is called the Church of God. They can't. There's two churches of God. There's one that's more of a Pentecostal movement that does like the snake handling and stuff. Those like
Hmm.
sort of faith exercises and stuff. That's the South Carolina group. That's not the group I grew up in. I grew
Okay.
up in the group that started in Anderson, Indiana. It was started out of like a holiness movement essentially in the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century. All these new Protestant movements started popping up around the United States, specifically in reaction to some of the changes that were occurring in religious belief in that time, as well as changes in culture and the social world and stuff. But really, in reaction to their environment, they started to sort of reincorporate themselves into different types of religious communities. And this one came up and was it was a fairly insular, but in general, actually, not in terms of holiness movements that pop up in the 19th century, it's one of the good ones, I would say. They had a very sort of inward facing model, a decentralized sort of structure that placed an emphasis on worship as an active community rather than as a
Hmm.
transactional sort of a thing like people in the evangelical church experience a lot nowadays. Um, and my church that I grew up in was nothing like that at all. Over that next 100 years, basically, it became the Southern Baptist Convention, but Wesleyan instead. So, like when push came to shove, the church that I grew up in was bourgeois, specifically toward owners and like the more wealthy among us. If you were working class, then you needed to incorporate yourself into that scheme. And then essentially, it was a church for upward mobility and upward mobility only. Like most modern contemporary evangelical churches, it's much more about class than people realize. And it's much more about where you sit within this sort of scheme of class than people realize. And then, as we know, that those issues get bound up in, especially issues of race. The school that I went to was filled with people who didn't look like me, like
Hmm.
split three different ways. I went to high school in coastal Florida, so I was surrounded by black people, by Mexicans. All of my friends were like essentially like a part of a longer sort of journey of their families.
Yeah.
It was a really eye-opening, and it's an experience I'm extremely grateful for because it taught me so much about how upward mobility and race sort of intersect with one another. But this is all to say basically that I went to a church that professed to talk about the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and then spent most of its time making sure that its pastor could keep making $100,000 a year,
Hmm.
and that he could keep bragging about it. He's an awful person. I can't stand him. And so, as a extremely gay kid growing up, super gay, one could say, I had some difficulty being a student leader in the church, which I was, as in like, and
Hmm.
not even just like the participating in youth group and coming to everything or whatever. No, it was I was leading the worship band. I went to the national conventions that you had to be nominated for. That you
Wow.
like all the like if like this is the upper echelon of like kayfabe church crap that
Yeah.
like essentially like they were trying to form us into the next generation of like bourgeois shitheads. But like really what I learned from that upbringing is, I'm not gonna lie, just about every single effective organizing tactic that I've ever used, because
Right.
evangelical churches are run on volunteer leadership. They do not pay people. They pay pastors. They may pay a front office assistant, and that's about it. And so at the end of the day, what you need to do is you need to figure out how to get people to do things for you for free. You need to figure out how to motivate people, and you need to figure out how to not treat them like dog shit when you're in this context, and how to not let them get burnt out, how to keep pouring into them, how to essentially, like, these values that are the way that they intended them were very corporate. It was very like, you find your next assistant manager sort of a thing. But I was lucky enough to have some people in my life who translated this into a much more like a much more substantive way of interacting with people. And the principles that I took away from it in terms of organizing are threefold. And I know that they're threefold because I use them all the time. I tell everyone about this. It, like, creating a space. And what I learned from growing up in the Christian church and being a student leader and stuff was that when you're creating spaces in which you need to rely on volunteer leadership, you have to be principled in a few different ways. The first one is making sure that people feel welcome, which is everything from your basic hospitality, making sure, like, getting there early and setting up chairs so no one else has to do anything, making sure that someone gets greeted, all of the usual stuff, as well as making sure that the space is, like, inclusive and, like, a positive, that it's created in such a way that people can understand it. It's familiar, but even if it's different, there's a little familiarity. That's one part of it, both very practical as well as sort of, and not impractical, but a more sort of theoretical, if you will, sort of purpose. And the second part of it, you need to make sure that they feel loved, which means not in the usual sort of, like, performative stuff, but love to me means follow-up. When someone has difficulty in their life, you expressed genuine interest in their problems, and then you follow up about those problems. Because if that teaches anybody anything about you, it teaches you that you're thinking about them and that you're paying attention to what happens in their life. And what that tells them is that that shit matters. And that is everything in terms of building relationships with people. And then the third thing is to make them feel needed, which is very simply, when someone comes in and they want to get involved, give them something to do. And make sure that you're giving them something that is going to fulfill this need that we all have within us to be a part of a community, to sort of reinforce, our values in a way that's incorporated not just, by ourselves individually, like liberalism tells us to, but like across the spectrum of different types of people. Now, these values were not lived by the vast majority of the Christians that I grew up with. Bless them. Some of them are fine people. Some of them are even good people. They did not live these values. And the reason why is because I nor anybody else was given the tools to truly, like, sort of wrap my mind around sort of the material conditions of people that we find in our community. More than anything, what I learned is that the fake Christians will only talk around poverty. They won't actually talk about poverty. At the end of the day, poverty is a tool. It's an addendum on some kind of other argument that you have, rather than in and of itself the actual problem. And so I heard a lot about how we should love the poor, how that which you do unto the least of these, you also do unto me. I heard a lot about the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount or whatever, but it was all removed from any kind of actual substantive context. And rather, it was about slapping Band-Aids on problems that, I mean, if we were, like, I felt like I was actually doing what I was supposed to do. Like, this means that you need to treat rough sleepers with respect, and you need to do things for others within that context. The homeless matter. It means that people who have been sort of abandoned by their families and their communities and stuff, they need you and they rely on you. But it was never just about that. It was always about doing things in a particular way. It was always about with particular people, about not being too radical, but just being radical enough. And then there were these conflicts in my head, like these sort of paradoxes, really, that I just couldn't reconcile. And so I started pursuing sort of my own sort of mode of engagement in these contexts, and came out the other side extremely left wing. I started when I was like 15, a very conservative politically church as well. they should have lost their tax exempt status when George W. Bush was president. There is no doubt in my mind that they violated
Yeah.
so many laws doing that. But when I was, 15 and 16, I had already decided, I'm like, okay, the Iraq War, that doesn't seem very Christian to me, so that sucks. So I don't like those people. Like, what do I do about all of this? And then radical theology came very quickly to me. And then when I ended up at a liberal arts college, but a Christian liberal arts college, the university that was established with the faith tradition that I grew up in, I was there for 2 years. I went there and I started a degree in religious studies, and I met the religious studies faculty of this university. As it turns out, the religious studies faculty of this university are nothing like the board of this university. The board of this university is filled with all the blue hairs that you imagine, who all make, between their two incomes, $175,000 a year, but who see themselves as just like the pinnacle of faithfulness and generosity and love, joy, peace, etc., fruits of the spirit. But like, and then you meet the religious studies professors, and they're like, yeah, America is imperialist. Like, imperialism is not Christian. Ergo, like, the United States is not Christian in any meaningful or substantive way. All of these critiques that I had internalized and that I understood and that I saw, but I didn't know if they were right or not. And then I got in there, and it turns out all these guys who had read all the same stuff that I did, and then they learned it in the original language, and then they read it in the original language and stuff, came to all the same fucking conclusions that I did. And so as a result, I stopped caring about what the people that I grew up with thought when it came to Christianity, because my conclusion was, quite frankly, they have no idea what they're talking about.
That reminds me something that I see in a lot of people talking about leaving their conservative Christian tradition is that it wasn't that they just didn't believe enough, or they could never believe enough, is that they fully believed everything all the way 100% and realized everyone else around them wasn't actually fully believing all of it 100%.
Yeah.
And which led to disappointment and discouragement, and realized that they had to go. And that there was always, and it's plenty of people who leave Christian communities for Christian reasons and feel like, and then end up entering into spaces that are completely non-Christian in order to fulfill what they feel like is their Christian duty. And so that's been interesting too. A lot of people who have started to watch my channel have a similar story, saying things like, I used to be and growing up in a conservative church, and then I left, and then I somehow found my way into some sort of socialist politics, and then I found you, and now I'm so relieved and excited to hear this stuff talked about in a more healthy, responsible way.
Yeah.
And that's like really inspiring for me. It's also funny. I've never talked about this, but it would be hilarious to talk about with you. I realize, like, okay, so what I just said is just basic what it is. There's no agenda underneath it. It's like I just happen to be here talking about this stuff. I like talking about this stuff with people. The more people, the better. But it's funny how it also happens to still fit the old framing of when people would talk about missionary work and like entering into a community, becoming one of them, and then getting them to turn to Jesus. And I feel like I could easily go back to those old friends and say, I'm doing that with the socialist community online.
I mean,
it's just hilarious.
Well, kind of, yeah. Well, here's the thing, and you're doing so in such a way that's not like speaking of imperialism, right? Yeah. Like, mission work is peak imperialism. Like, in particular, like we don't even have to look at it in a contemporary period. You can look at it historically. Like, the French civilizing mission is what jumps to mind the most. The French civilizing mission was something that was supported by and reinforced by religious communities as a means for, conversion, right? But what they either realized and didn't care, or didn't realize, or, I think they realized because it just fit within the discursive sort of gestures of their moment, but is that, like, they were in effect, the civilizing mission was, as we know, anything but. Just even the idea of a civilizing mission is about as Orientalist as you can imagine. But like, even more, I think they maybe didn't even realize how integrated into empire they actually were. In the way that, like, empire itself, like, empire is not just, a concept of imperialism, but empire is this idea that, like, diffuses itself within society, and that we can start to see the manifestations and the gestures of empire to bubble up from these other sections. This is Antonio Negri, basically. And I in general just agree with sort of the assertions that they had in that book. Empire is that, like, we think about imperialism as this sort of broader, like sort of a physical manifestation of like nationalisms in these various contexts, and then the sort of like spreading of those nationalisms as like as some sort of central goal, like the aforementioned civilizing mission, Germany's sort of lurch into sort of like a modernity in the 19th century, how basically like if you wanted to be a hip European country, you got to go like subjugate a bunch of Africans and then like be a total asshole. So they went and did that. Or the sort of economic justifications in British imperialism, like basically creating like a literal, like you can see it on the map, extraction that moves all the way down from South Africa, follows railroads that do not connect any of these communities together, but go straight up to the metropole up through Egypt. And so there is these like the missionary sort of discourse or ideal or whatever is if it's separated again from materiality, if we remove it from the material world, if we remove it from our surroundings, the things that we see, that we hear, that we can understand, then of course it all seems great. But then you turn around and you ground it back in this sort of, you use a material critique to sort of investigate it again, and you realize, oh, this is extraction capital, and this is religion yet again, in religious people yet again, not always through the fault of their own, exercising their agency within the context of imperialism, rather against the context of imperialism. So you see this disconnect between like sort of what mission means. Mission is out. It is other. Mission is outside of a border even. It's a very contemporary idea to think about it that way. It's very much born within sort of the nationalisms of the liberal period. This idea that like the sort of inward facing of like Western European countries, like in terms of, our greatness will be projected out, but only our greatness shall do so. So you see settler colonial states start to pop up, and these sort of, satellite states, colonies, rather than just sort of the imperialist sort of extraction that came before that, with say the Dutch, for example. Slowly imposing yourself on these places. And what you're doing instead is essentially removing the border, because what people need to understand is that border does not make people less or more Christian than you. That border does not make people less or more X, Y, or Z anything than you. Those borders in these countries and these places are contemporary constructions that we use to order the social world. Most of the time, the borders that we're looking at in these countries were drawn by Europeans anyways. Africa, that is absolutely the case. So what we know is that mission work is not exactly what it seems to be, right? Okay, then what is it exactly? Well, it is not acknowledging supposed barriers between yourself and between another community, either barriers based off of all the things we talked about, class rates, etc., or based off of religious belief. A lack of, like, I am not being prevented from being in this space on my own. I am only being prevented from that space by some sort of intervening force or whatever. So rather than thinking about like mission work as this sort of intercession or whatever, mission work becomes this inward facing, we subsume ourselves underneath some sort of boundary by place, by person, by belief, by politics, by whatever. And so instead of like trying to move, basically like imperialism does, and like Christian mission in imperialism tries to do, move the border of the metropole over to the other end and to incorporate all of those people as, French or as British or as, to sort of build a space in which they can be considered in some ways, French or British. Rather than that, because we know that collapses, because it did in the 20th century. It took the French a long time, but like they eventually decided, oh no, Africans aren't French anymore, we should decolonize. And it's like, well, 5 minutes ago it seemed like y'all were saying, oh, they're all French or whatever. But we know that these are fluid. These are not fixed ideas or whatever. So what is a fixed idea within the context of a mission? Well, to me, it's only sort of the fundamental gestures of the self, and then how our self interacts with all these other people. So your mission work, moving like outside of this sort of like binary of like the Christians and then the other, and then you go to the other to do the Christian work, you realize that well, shit, I mean, I don't think the Christian work is being done all that well by these institutional churches, even within the borders of their own nations, and then it gets even worse when it goes out. So maybe I should not think about mission like that, and maybe instead I should recognize it as my own stirring, and then me moving toward maybe some rupture of an event to where I can, sort of not impose my values, but incorporate my values as a means for gifting people either the tools or the resources or whatever it is they need. So
Yeah.
that's a big long thing, but I think you're doing all right. Say.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's funny, as I search this out, I continue to, like I said, find a lot of ways that leftist movements are doing what the church has refused to do. And I even see, like, looking at the history of it all, realizing that the reason leftist movements even came into being is because the role of sticking up for the poor and fighting for their liberation that used to be taken on by the church was given up by the church. And people looked around and realized the church is now one of the systems of power that poor people need to be liberated from. And then we get Marxism, anarchism, like all this stuff. And that's like really interesting to see too. And it's interesting, like even the whole from each according to their ability to each according to their need, that was in the New Testament first. But you hear that like, oh no, that's communism, and like with very scare quotes and everything. And it's and this concept of like solidarity too, it was in the New Testament too. And I think of all the ways that they're doing that way better as well. And like seeing, and Paul saying, like Galatians, to bear one another's burdens, to be the body of Christ, and each part of the body matters. And when one suffers, the other suffer, because we're all part of the same body.
Yes.
But you see that seems to not be as strong in several contemporary churches. It seems like it is, but then when you compare it to how strong that concept is in like unions, for example, or the IWW, it's like, oh, this looks way more like what Paul was probably talking about. And they have their slogan too: an injury to one is an injury to all. And it's interesting like how that is being carried out by these secular leftist movements now.
Yeah, well, I mean, by the grace of God, I am what I am. It is, I am, this is the idea. There is no pre-qualification for, subjectivity in Christianity. And what I mean by that is that there's no pre-qualification for us encountering anybody within any religious context, political context, or whatever. There's no pre-qualifications for our encounter with a powerful and meaningful event. And the encounter of the grace of God, which develops into, by the grace of God, I am what I am, is about how people are fully constituted by that powerful event, and that the identity that someone in solidarity, say someone who's striking, a striking worker, the fidelity that they feel to this event is not about declaring this event as universal. That like we can't do that. We've tried to declare universal rights of man. We've tried to create sort of universal emancipatory programs within the context of like Western liberal democracies across the past 200 years. And those, as we know, it was not what it said it was. And that's the problem, is that when you think of yourself, if you're a Christian and you think of yourself as constituted of something besides, something outside of the grace of God, by the grace of God, I am what I am, means that this, for it to truly be within that like sort of very poetic like rupture, for that it to truly like for us to truly be able to like think of ourselves as the subjective person who can then identify with this powerful and meaningful event, doesn't require us to just declare the event as universal. It's universal, so there we go. It's universal. We did it. No, allegiance and a passionate fidelity to the event, our allegiance to the event and what we do in terms of how we treat the others within that event is the potential universalism that people are looking for in these sort of big events. And to me, the way that a strike relates to Christianity is about event. It is specifically about how the idea that the authority of a new path, the authority for people to make their own future, to create historical agency, is established by these powerful events. For a Christian, for Paul, for example, let's use the Apostle Paul. For the Apostle Paul, he's a thinker of event, as Alain Badiou says. Like the idea is that our human connection emerges through our interaction and our relationship with this event. And for Paul, the resurrection of Jesus Christ was the biggest rupture that had occurred in that moment. It was the event of Paul becoming Paul started with the road to Damascus and then went through the execution and then through the resurrection and manifested itself as this radical changing event. And the only reason why it has any kind of universal value is because people like Paul and other early Christians, and all Christians really, are trying to give shape to this. They're allowing themselves to be reshaped and changed by the event, and then they're incorporating themselves into it. So basically what I mean by that is that the resurrection for Paul as a fundamental radical change of who he is, it is now by the grace of God, I am who I am. It's Corinthians, I think. Like this event is the development of a working class identity, class consciousness, and then the understanding of what solidarity actually means when the rubber hits the road. And what we know, the strike is a really good example of that. This is a rupture of my relationship with my workplace. I think of my workplace under liberalism, say just your average Joe, average working class person. I think about my workplace as this, like, it's the place that I go, and it's the thing where I go and I do what the boss says. And yeah, I don't really have any power or anything, but I do okay. I don't make enough money necessarily to kind of make stuff work, but it could be on me. It could be on my boss. I'm not going to sit around and try and figure it out because we're supposed to be, we're all in this together, so to speak. And so, I don't see any kind of like a means for me to engage in my workplace and make something different. Work is just work. But when you start to organize within your workplace, you realize that work is not just work. It is this place that is filled with human beings, not just human beings, but human beings. If we're doing that which, if it's that which unto the least of these you also do unto me. Well, these are a lot of the least of these. Working people, and then those who have been classed below working people, as Marx called them, lumpen proletariat, but I think that's a little too simplistic. But the idea is that, like, work stops being just this place. I now feel agency within my workplace because I have it. And the reason why I have it is because I'm organizing with other people. I'm protected by the National Labor Relations Act. I am realizing that I can get the things that I need in my workplace. The only problem is I was trying to do it by myself. And what I'm realizing that the only way to actually confront the boss is to do it with a group of people. So you incorporate yourself amongst a group of people, and then like that becomes this very cool, powerful thing. Well, if the rubber really hits the road and you get all the way to the end of the road, and that's where strike happens, when you hit strike, you're a part of this. And if you've ever been on a picket line, you can sort of understand. I'm a very emotional person, so I'm always feel like I'm tapped into that, and I hate it, but it offers its advantages sometimes. If you're ever on a picket, like, and you want to know what solidarity feels like, as in on your skin, like when, like if you like thinking about, like I'm someone who gets panic attacks, so you have to like, and if you get those, like it's good to think about like your presence, so you try and imagine yourself touching the air around you. It basically, it forces you to slow down. It's like, you know, people like me don't have a lot of brakes up here, like in the front of our brain. And so you have to use techniques to sort of hit the brakes a little bit to not get mad or not get emotional or whatever. Yeah. But what it teaches you is about this sort of, it's, you know, mindfulness as they call it. Yeah. But like, I have that feeling in a strike because you're outside and you're surrounded by people, and you can, with every part of your senses, you can sort of, you feel yourself a part of something that's not so atomized as we always feel. But it's like, wow, I actually feel like this is what solidarity feels like. And then all of this occurs into this complete reconfiguration of how we see ourselves in our workplaces. It's no longer about, well, I just got to go in and, you know, sort of grind like I've always done. You know, like everyone told me growing up, if you want a job, you go and you grab a broom and you sweep the floor until the boss gives you a job, and then you're going to be CEO in a year. Like all this bullshit that didn't actually happen. I worked so hard, none of that actually happened. Yeah. So like we're forced to like, when is the world around us like confronted ever outside of like literally what we're doing right now? The reason why people are talking about strikes right now is because they realize that, oh, I left my workplace and the world didn't end. Like, oh, I didn't do a whole lot of work today. Oh, you know what, the work, maybe I'm not an essential as of an employee as this company seems to make me think, that my work is, everything's going to fall apart without me. And then you think, oh, well, where else have they been bullshitting me here? Like, exactly. Well, like, and then you see that in this emergency situation that they're like in New York, for example, they just did cut 100% of non-essential workers. Who was on the list of essential workers? Nurses, paramedics, grocery store workers, which if you don't think grocery store workers are non-essential, well, I think you know now that they're essential. This is an event that has caused a complete reconfiguration in the way that people see their world. I swear to God, I was sitting on my porch like earlier, and I heard someone talking on the phone, and they're just like, you know, we could shut this whole motherfucker down, right? I don't hear that around here. Yeah. Like real. I'm like, whoa. I'm just like snaps, like for real. Right. I want to just be like, hey, like whoever that is, like call me. Yeah. Come to my apartment. I'll help you organize. Like, but like a strike and the resurrection of Jesus Christ aren't as different as people think they are. And the similarity is event, and how event is not something that just happens and then it's over. How there are people within that event who have thoughts, beliefs, desires. They have an understanding of the world that gets completely thrown out when you realize that a lot of the stuff that people had been sort of feeding you in this time wasn't actually what was happening in front of you. And so then, more than anything, as I was saying earlier, the idea that like this event like forces us to figure out fidelity. This event forces us to figure out like how, like what happens to me when I go out and I do something so powerful like this, like confront my boss in a system in which the boss gets all of the perks, every single one of the perks. And so like when our subjectivity, our identity as human beings gets incorporated into this fidelity, as I was calling it, we can call it solidarity. When identity and solidarity become intermixed with each other, which often happens in event, when all the barriers of neoliberalism that are trying to keep us from keeping solidarity with each other, well, those barriers are not 100% real. They fall apart under the smallest amount of scrutiny, and one global crisis, all of it just starts crumbling, and everyone can see all of the fucking contradictions that are present in front of themselves. And so like, it's not enough for us to, and then at the end of the day, what it means is that like event, it's not enough for us to just declare it. It's not enough for us just to universalize it. It requires an interaction with a physical space. It requires doing something. And if there is anything that is a passionate resurrection of the power that is the event of the sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth, then it is absolutely engaging in that physical space. It is absolutely a confrontation of previously held values. It is absolutely, as you with your voice said in my video, it's an absolute greatest hits when it comes to the critique of theology, of religious belief, of institutions. What we are talking about is the critique of idolatry. What we're talking about is the removal of the power of idols over people's lives. And this idol can be capitalism. This idol can be a literal idol. But at the end of the day, what we know is that it is idolatry. And it is one of the oldest Christian traditions in the entire world. And if anything is applicable to a critique of our workplace conditions, it is that. And I blacked out for about 5 minutes. So your turn.
I was thinking it is super interesting too how people like realizing that they actually have power right now, and that seemed to be very much what Jesus was trying to get people to realize too, is that we do have power when we come together and express solidarity and are able to protect one another, which is very important. And I was even thinking as we're preparing for this too, how multiple verses throughout the Gospels say they wanted to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't because of the crowds. Because the crowds were protecting Jesus, which is interesting because there are plenty of people who were talking about the stuff Jesus was talking about and were put on crosses and arrested and put on a cross, executed, or fed to wild beasts earlier than Jesus had progressed to. And so it's interesting, especially when he goes to Jerusalem, because that must mean that someone or a few people must have sent a message saying, you have followers here, so it's okay to come here, because it's way more dangerous to try to talk about this stuff in Jerusalem and by the temple. And so he goes and they pull a double demonstration where he comes in on a donkey from the east. And some scholars think it might be possible that they timed it just right so that Pilate is coming in from the west on a battle horse while Jesus is coming from the east on a donkey, sending that kind of message. And then the next day, they do another demonstration in the temple where he starts flipping tables and says, you're treating this place like a den of thieves when it should be a place of worship. And each night he goes to Bethany, because if you're in Jerusalem at nighttime in the dark, then that's super dangerous and can get arrested. So it's like, it doesn't talk about the planning, but there must have been very careful planning with this, and organizing, where he would go into Jerusalem during the day, do demonstrations, then at night sneak to Bethany to be safe, and then come back in the morning. And then he does that for a few days until Thursday night. He is found out by Caiaphas. They realize that they're making that trip back and forth each night. And what I find extremely interesting, which I haven't heard anyone talk about, is the moment Jesus actually gets arrested is the moment that the people with him fall asleep, when they're not doing their job and watching out for him and protecting him like you're supposed to do in this movement of solidarity and fidelity to one another. His partners in this fall asleep. And then that's why he's so angry. Like, could you not fall asleep? And now the soldiers are here, and then they arrest him. And I imagine that they especially feel like terrible about that, because they were supposed to be protecting him each night as they go back and forth. And then I think it's also super interesting. Jesus comes back from the dead, and John, especially John, is super interesting the way that John frames the resurrection story, because he comes back, meets them at the beach, and all the disciples are still together. It's like Jesus picked all of these people out of obscurity who weren't in each other's lives and brought them together. And then he is killed. And then he finds them on the beach, all still hanging out together, fishing. And I think that's extremely interesting too, because whether Jesus literally physically came back or not, I think the power in that story is that they were still together and that they continued what Jesus was talking about. And then even that turned into forming these communities in each city, and the Church of Rome, the Church of Ephesus, the Church of Galatia, the Church of Corinth, and being able to create these alternative communities alternate to the way that Caesar said a better world is brought about, and being able to share property and protect one another, and being able to fulfill even further what Jesus had inspired within them. And so it's like those movements of solidarity and fidelity in response to an event is all over the gospel and feels like so powerful. And like I said, it's interesting to see it strongest in these leftist movements instead of Christianity.
It isn't. Well, I mean, it is. It is legitimately interesting. Like, what happened, like, in the disconnect between, like, well, in it's a scholarly problem, right? Because then you're like, okay, we have to go back to sources. Okay, like when were the sources created? When did people have the sources? How were they taught? And then, okay, how did these sources then incorporate themselves into the Roman Empire? And then sort of, all various alterations, various contextualizations, various canonizations sort of manifest themselves in a particular way. And then how do they end up within the hands of these certain people? And then how did those people sort of interact with, and how, like, it's all of these, it's these historical forces, these sort of, sociocultural forces that exist within history that sort of, like that in the context of religious belief, like, and like, I am not going to lie. And I apologize if I'm painting with too broad of a brush. I've met a lot of pastors in my life, like a ton of them, plenty of them who are brilliant, plenty of them who have great qualifications when it comes to analyzing theology. I have met one pastor in my entire life who's good at talking about history. None of the other ones have any idea what they're talking about, and it sucks. And I don't think it's necessarily their fault. I think we're bad at teaching history. I think divinity colleges can be very bad at teaching history. God bless some of the people who work there. Some of them are great, but not all of them. And so there's this dearth of voices who are willing to get into the nitty gritty of, like, exactly as you were describing. It's what made me think of this conversation. The pastor I'm referring to this is the best news of all of this, my parents' current pastor. My parents have recently moved to a new church, and holy crap, if I am doing everything within my power to keep them at that church. The pastor is a friend of mine. I would consider him a friend. My mom knew him before I did, but when I met him, he and I we really hit it off. Not gonna lie, he's straight me. He's like straight in, like, Midwestern, like, me. So he's he's just a little more like, he's just kind of a standard, like, corn-fed kind of guy, but he has just, not only would he agree with, my guess would be he'd agree with a great deal of what we're saying here, but he has a way of using historical sources with people who are so uninterested in learning about history, explicitly uninterested in learning about history, because they know history from it's a bunch of mid 40s and 50s sort of like boomer white people who are, like, trying to do good by being in a more community and community oriented and loving church with a pastor who places a huge emphasis on teaching and learning, which, oh my goodness, heaven for fucking bid, like, a pastor actually teach something instead of do a bunch of pop psychology. But, like, it's incredible to see what he does, because he did exactly what you just did. He took the geography. He uses maps a lot. And he uses geography to help people place themselves more readily within those contexts. So they don't, all I knew is that growing up is that every single place that was featured in both the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures felt like Narnia to me, because it was shown that way. Like, yeah,
for sure.
It really is. And then they talk about it in such a way that's just so silly, and honestly is extremely racist. And they don't even realize that, but, like, they don't understand the practical elements that go into literally what happened in these historical events that you're reading about. They don't read any other historical sources from antiquity. That my parents' pastor reads historical sources from antiquity. So he understands that, like, these are written in a particular style. Paul's epistles are formatted like other epistles, like Greco-Roman epistles. He's working with a tradition that he was probably familiar with as he got sort of. There's a scholarly argument about this, and unfortunately, as someone who has published on Paul, I've had to insert myself into this argument. But I'm generally of the ilk that says that Paul, he didn't receive. There's essentially three levels of education in Roman education. Paul got to the middle one, in my opinion. And the middle one is, and it's a big deal. Like some people don't get any of it. Like if you're a slave, you're not getting any of it. You can't read or write. Like the middle one, you start to learn about rhetoric and logic. And I'm probably getting it mixed up because I haven't read it in a while. But you get the idea. Like he understood. He was a human being who lived and breathed in this world. He took actions. He made choices. He was an agent. These are not storybook characters. And all I see in Christian churches is teleology. And what I mean, teleology as in like an historical event was bound to happen based off of all these previous criteria. And it's something that historians did in like the 19th century. That was really stupid. That like they decided that there were inevitabilities, and that if you track the results of, like, if you track what happened beforehand, you encounter the inevitability. That's a teleology. And it sounds a lot like the way that people look at the Bible. Well, this was bound to happen. Well, was it? How do you know? And was it bound to happen this way? Did it happen this way, or did it happen in a way that we can see in a non-canonical source, for example? Did it happen in the way that Paul sort of like describes it, in the way that he sort of like he nods to like the Christ narrative? And then when the Gospels came after that, did they use that? Well, no, probably not. They were in different, and see where you go. Like, what this tells me is that it doesn't tell me that everyone needs to become a biblical scholar, because holy shit, none of us have the time. But what it does tell us is that the picture that we're given of antiquity that involves Christianity is not antiquity, because it is Christianity as an exception rather than as an historical event, the emergence of something that is exceptional. Yes, absolutely. But it's an historical event, and we can analyze it as such. That's what Alain Badiou is trying to do. He's philosophically analyzing it, but he has sort of these constructions of event and what exactly he, sort of thinks, like how event is, like what constitutes it exactly. And you can apply all of this stuff to historical sources. And in case people just think I'm, blowing smoke out of my ass, Alain Badiou wrote a book about Paul, an event, and it's called The Foundation of Universalism. And actually, it's very good. A lot of continental philosophers have written about Paul. Some okay, some not okay. Zizek, I'm sorry. I like you, but your book sucks. Not all of it, but a lot of it sucks. But this book, while it's not right all the time, it has by far, to me at least, the most compelling like source of analysis that comes to the Apostle Paul when it comes to something that's not just within this theological tradition of exception. I don't understand why a teleology of Christianity is better than a radical event erupting within historical contexts. I don't understand why sort of a Calvinistic kind of designation of event as an inevitable occurrence through the sort of the vision of God that has sort of pushed the world into motion, and then knows, a crow falls and I saw it, like that God. Like, I don't understand why like that is in and of itself either completely separated, prioritized above, and not, in my opinion, what needs to happen, readily incorporated within our theological understanding of Jesus, of what happened in the New Testament. Because in this case, like, it's not only Christians who are getting a whole bunch of stuff out of this. It's kind of what really the meta point of my last video on YouTube was about, which is that when you sit around and you just go, oh, religion, blah, which, I generally agree. Yeah, in general, I kind of agree. But like when you do that, like that's first of all, that's not interesting. That's not an interesting argument. I don't find that interesting. So sorry, not interesting. Secondly, it's extraordinarily incomplete, and it is absolutely removed from not just important and significant historical context, but historical context that will actually like allow people who aren't within Christianity to realize how important an analysis of religious belief, of the church, of all kinds of sort of like religious constructions, of spirituality, of theology, et cetera, all of it applies to you. It's not this like it's one of the oldest systems of belief in like the history of humanity, religious traditions, spirituality, theology, whatever you want to call it, like however we're interpreting in that moment. Like be it from the Abrahamic traditions, non-Abrahamic traditions, indigenous traditions, or whatever. None of this is created in a vacuum, and none of it is preserved in historical amber. It is a part of a long continuation of historical processes, ruptures, changes, and then these individual people who are asserting their agency within that. To me, that's using Christianity to talk to a whole lot of people. And I just think I think that should be the point of like if we're talking about theology, if we're talking about like sort of, I think that, and I don't know if this is a controversial statement. I haven't been in circles like this for a really long time, but I don't find the question of the quote unquote existence of God to be an interesting question literally at all. It right. is. It's.
I agree.
Okay, good. Because it's not. That's boring. I'm sorry. It's not good enough.
It is controversial to plenty of Christians who haven't studied this stuff for sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It's like the more you study it, the more that's like I've heard that's like the most taboo question to ask a theology professor is, do you believe in God? Because it's like, well, what do you mean at this point? You have to ask like, what do you mean by believe? What do you mean by in? What do you mean by God? And maybe what do you believe by you? Like, what are you talking about?
Yes, and yes. There's not like when you run into those critiques of the question itself, you realize that the question is flawed. It's just it's not a good question. And
actually, a theology professor like Tad DeLay, who's super into radical theology and psychoanalysis, he said the way he answers that question when students ask him is, "I try not to." But he says like no matter what, it still comes up, and it's like it's part of him, and he can't like exactly get rid of it.
I mean, that's kind of a really good way. That's a good way to summarize. I always say that when people ask me that question, I said, "Do you have 3 hours?" Because like I mean, and for like it's totally a joke, but it's a real joke too. Like that's probably the amount of time that I could come close to describing how I sort of see this stuff. But the only reason why I have those beliefs and those opinions and sort of that, those ideas, and I've spent so much time thinking about them, is because of that. It's like, well, I try and do the explicit sort of like, atheistic sort of, I try being, an edgy, atheist bro or whatever. I never tried that, but like hypothetically, like, but what you realize is that, like, don't you want to have like 2 things? One, don't you want to not be an asshole? Doesn't that sound nice? Second of all, don't you want to actually ask and like pose interesting and different questions to like the people who are around you? Like, I don't understand. Like, I don't know. I'm rambling. Night.
Right. Yeah. I saw a meme recently. There was it was like a remix of an old climate change meme, but it was a conference of Christians, and on the screen it was pretty much the works of mercy, like feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give thirsty to the poor, take care of one another. And then someone in the back was like, but what if it's all a big hoax and a lie? And it's just to show like this is what a ridiculous thing to say when it's like there's so many people trying to do something like way deeper. And that's like, it's so many of those questions are like the wrong questions, and there's like this thing is like so much more deeper than people can imagine, and it's something that it's a completely different thing. But something I wanted to bring up to, like earlier you were talking about the people who realize that they have power in their workplace and feel like they can't do it by themselves, and so they need to find other people. And that concept I've even seen within my own spiritual journey in Christian groups, how everything was framed to me so individualistically. Even Paul's writings was framed individualistically, and Paul was constantly talking about the body of Christ. When one suffers, the other suffers, and all this. And one of the like mind-blowing things I realized was I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and there was a lot of talk of spiritual gifts, and it was interesting because we were constantly made to feel like we need to have as many spiritual gifts as we can, especially like speaking in tongues. We're like, we got to speak in tongues. Everyone must pray for that, their spiritual language. And I remember multiple times in that environment encountering older men who felt so inadequate because they couldn't do it, and constantly asking for prayer from others. And we would, in a group around them, pray for them, and they still wouldn't be able to do it. And another time we do it. And it was just so many people I've had met. And that's what got me to actually, I question the whole concept of speaking in tongues as meaning the absolute most sincere, faithful people who felt inadequate because they couldn't. And then I was in plenty of groups. I even led some groups where we would talk about discovering your spiritual gifts, and we would take like tests to find out your spiritual gifts. And I would even lead those. And what was funny is I remember a group I was part of where it would do percentages, like here's your top most likely and your bottom ones, and it was supposed to just help categorize, but we all viewed it as like, oh my god, it just sucks that these are my bottom ones. Everyone would pay attention to their bottom, so it's like my top ones were like teacher, wisdom, prophet, pastor, and I remember my bottom at the bottom was what was it? Like giving, pretty much was the bottom one, and then everyone was making fun of me for it. It's like, oh my god. So here's what's funny though. So you go back to Paul and talking about spiritual gifts, and he doesn't make it seem like you all need to have all of these. He says the church will have spiritual gifts. He says you, plural, will have the spiritual gifts. And then when he describes the gatherings, he says stuff like someone will have a word, someone will have a prayer, someone else will have a hymn, someone else will speak in tongues. It's like someone will have a gift. Just gather around and somebody will have a gift. It's not that you need to make sure you have each and every gift. And that totally blew my mind in realizing the discrepancy to how I grew up being taught these verses.
Sounds like a Quaker meeting, right? Like, which are bad. Personally, I think they're badass. I've been to a Quaker meeting.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So some Christian communities have figured it out a lot better, but it was just so weird realizing how individualistic they've twisted some of these verses. And then lastly, one of the things that I've told multiple people for years, even before I had that realization, was that verse people like to quote a lot, like God will never give you more than you can handle, or God will not test you beyond your strength. That you there is plural, not singular. It's to a community. Your community will never have something that it's too hard for you to handle. Individually, of course, will die alone. And but I see that so clearly in the Bible. But I wanted to hear you also talk about what are the ways that individuals can see that as well, and in unionizing and striking, how actually when we get together, stuff goes down.
Oh, absolutely. So there's a bunch of reasons why, and we can get into all of them. But I want to start with there are practical reasons for this. In the same way that there would be, and I truly believe this, a practical implication for the particularities of the biblical sources that you have been talking about this entire time in the building of Christian communities or whatever. There's an intent that's present within this. And so it forces us to say, okay, how are we organizing ourselves in a way that's advantageous? Like the example that you use, like sort of a competing procession of I'm going to humble myself. That guy's going to come in on a war horse. I'm going to ride a fucking ass. And we're going to see who's the real fucking man of the people. And we're going to see who, if a man of the people is someone who is of the people or someone who's above them, which is, those are the major sort of contradictions that, those narratives are pointing out. But I think, well, first of all, if you are in your workplace and you make a stink by yourself, you are not protected by the National Labor Relations Act. You are only protected under the National Labor Relations Act when it comes to organizing a union if you are doing so under the idea of what we call protected and concerted activity, which is a very specific part of the National Labor Relations Act. We used to call it the Wagner Act. It was passed in the early parts of the 20th century, essentially giving people. This is all the United States. I apologize. I only know U.S. labor law. Like it essentially it incorporates the right for workers to organize among themselves into trade unions or what have you in like labor law in the United States. So protected and concerted activity means that if you and another coworker are bringing up grievances about what we call unfair labor practices, a ULP, this is something that you could take to the National Labor Relations Board and say, my boss is violating my workplace by doing X, Y, or Z. He's preventing people from talking to each other and forming a union. He is inserting himself into conversations and then separating work. He's doing all this fucked up stuff. I don't want to get too far into it because I'll be here all day. The only way that you get protection in your workplace is by going with somebody else. Because then it's considered protected and concerted activity. So if in terms of the practicality of organizing a trade union in your workplace, you need other people because you cannot take advantage of the law if you don't. And your boss still has all of the power. But when we work together, here's what's crazy. And this is where I think it gets into the sort of bigger idea of why this matters. It's about strategy, yes. It's about, sort of solidarity, almost even like call it sort of this sort of like a spiritual solidarity, as in a solidarity that moves outside of the corporeal space and instead is a production of our consciousness or as a result of whatever, like whatever we want to call it. Like what happens when you and another coworker like approach your boss in this way, and then what happens after that is it's not always the same because some bosses have good lawyers, and it's not always the same because some bosses have been shitty bosses and have had union organizing campaigns in their workplaces before. But most of the time, when you organize with your coworkers and you all of a sudden have all of these protections for yourself, and you start like quoting the National Labor Relations Act and stuff, your boss's head is going to start just like they're going to short circuit because they've never had to deal with any of that stuff. The law,
right,
government, the way our society is set up is for their benefit. But what they don't realize is that we do have something that they don't. We do have a check on their power. But things have gone, we've been so sort of inundated with this, like, we are the worker and we are in service to the boss thing, that even we as workers, even we sometimes as class conscious people, left-wing people, what have you, don't fully understand how this stuff protects us. And most importantly, don't understand how organizing amongst each other gives us a distinct advantage over people who are more powerful than us. And there is both the practical element of how the fuck am I, someone who makes X dollars an hour, supposed to take on someone who literally owns the business that I work for? How am I supposed to do that? Well, you're not supposed to do that because you can't. And it's not going to work because it hasn't worked. What is it? And also, what is it going to do? It may get you a benefit, but the second you start asking for benefits for other people, well, the hammer's going to come down because, oh, we'll talk about you, but no. You don't have to worry about all of them. This is between you and me. Well, no, that's not the case. And the other thing that it gets us to do is to recognize that, and I don't mean this in an insidious way. I don't mean this in a violent way. I don't mean this in, any way besides that. We have enemies. Our enemies are human beings. Our enemies are those who would create destruction in our communities. Our enemies are the people who perpetuate true violence within our communities. I think a lot about this idea of like sanctioned and unsanctioned violence as like, it's a concept that Walter Benjamin talks about in this essay that he has that they make you read sometimes in undergrad or grad school if you study the humanities, but or especially philosophy, because it's an essay complicating the sort of ethical assertions of violence, which is basically he's complicating the idea that like there is violence that is lawmaking. There is violence that is law preserving. And what we know is that these lawmaking and these law preserving ideas are in incorporated into the social relations around us. And so that the justification, the ends justifying the means when it comes to an action, especially a violent action, are all for the people who are making laws or preserving laws. And that's a big problem, because we have to be able to like sort of conceptualize aggression, conceptualize like conflict outside of this lawmaking, law preserving binary that is sort of created by, really basically the people who are around us now. The powerful create that idea and say that there is only violence, like there is like lawful violence, and then there is unlawful violence, and this is how it is, rather than this sort of like, how aggression, like an assertion, even a violent one, is something that is done by those particular social relations. It's something that is reinforced by those social relations. And what in all actuality is the most violent and most aggressive and most cruel and the enemy for people who are seeking to protect working people, for people who are seeking to do unto the least of these in such a way that the enemy is this sanctioning of ends justifying the means for violence. And this violence is systemic. It is within our social and political relationships. It is within the relations of the causes that we see around us. What it is this sort of justification for the supremacy of the state, of the liberal state in this particular case, for the feudal state as well, for empires, like all of it. What we understand is that they say what is violent. They say what is cruel. They say what brings harm to people. First of all, fuck you. No, you don't get to say that. I get to say that. Screw you. You don't get to say that. Fuck you. First of all, that. But second of all, like, it's the most simple binary thing ever. And any of us who has been anywhere near or understands at all the implications of state violence in the United States in our contemporary moment or whatever, understands that the true the co-opting of violence comes from these apparatuses that are really unto the social relations that we see around us. As a result, when we're thinking about enemies and confrontation, most of the time in contemporary Christian communities, we're picturing a spiritual enemy, as they called it in the church that I grew up in, the enemy. That was always the term, the enemy, the enemy, the enemy. The enemy is a very useful thing for Christians to use, because who the fuck is that? Well, it's literally anyone you want it to be. And so it's very convenient for people who are interested in being we should allow Iraq wars to happen because the enemy. And so we see this idea of violence and of oppression, of cruelty, of the things that are supposed to be opposite to the values of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, the turn the other cheek guy, the Sermon on the Mount guy, who was not a peace and love hippie, but who saw love as a radical act through which you can restructure society around us in a way that favors the least of these rather than the powerful. What we see now and what we know is that the state, the liberal state, neoliberalism, capitalism, this is the monopoly on violence. This is where the conflict is, and this is who the enemy is. And yes, it is okay for a spiritual person to have an enemy. Yes, it is okay for a Christian to have an enemy. Yes, it is okay, because Jesus of Nazareth had fucking enemies. You know that much. And he made them. How did he make them? He did so through saying, you are the co-opting of violence. You are violence incarnate in the way that you structure our social world, in the way that you oppress people, in the way that you favor this group over all of these other people. The vast majority of people are subjected to your violence. And so as a result, what we know is that, first of all, they're feeding us a line of shit. They're full of shit. Okay, so we know that they're full of shit. Okay, so now we can move on. That we don't have to try and spin our wheels trying to justify the things that they tell us. And what we also know is that our critique of the world around us, Christian or not, as working people who are interested in furthering the values and furthering working people who are crushed under the boot of the powerful every single day, those values are essential designations for who is to be confronted in these situations. Because if you don't know the who, if it's the enemy, and not if it doesn't manifest itself in any way besides, I don't know, Democrats. I think that was maybe one thing that they thought. And I don't like the Democrats, but like that was basically the Democrats and Al Qaeda. That was the enemy, and the devil, the Democrats and Al Qaeda, like basically. And but I'm like, okay, so 3 enemies, cool. There's a lot of very violent and evil people in the world that you all seem to think are really, really cool. By the way, like y'all seem to love like Dick Cheney and shit. Like, what I don't understand is how now you are essentially parroting this co-opting of like this state sort of like imperialistic language. And well, what is at the end of the day is that the individualism within us like gives those social relations of violence an excuse to do whatever the fuck they want. And the reason why is because they are not confronted with anything that is more substantive, anything that is more powerful, and anything that is, in the way that Benjamin was describing it, outside of this legal binary. So what we can see is that, as I always say, at the end of the day, which I say over and over and over again, the co-opting of the cruelty by certain apparatuses, by certain people, like necessitates action against those people. And if spiritual people who are interested in bettering the lives of the poor and people who need you can't pick out a real enemy and can only work in spiritual abstractions, are absolutely missing every valuable, powerful, life-changing opportunity to do something meaningful, something impactful, and something extraordinary in the lives of other people. If you want to do that, do solidarity. If you don't want to do that, then do this liberal atomized bullshit, whatever it is, because I don't know another way around it. End of speech.
I feel you. Yeah, it's so interesting to see. There, even like I've been reading just a little bit about what it was like in the like American labor movement, FDR, socialists fighting for workers' rights, and how like there are a lot of socialists that also happen to be Christian. There are plenty of Christians that were socialists who were fighting for workers' rights and got us a lot of the rights we have now.
Eugene Debs, Dorothy Day, they're exactly. Americans, they're Christians, they're socialists.
Exactly. And so it's like there is a tradition here are already in place. You can point to the larger tradition of Christians who cared about justice, which we could do that all throughout 2,000 years, point to, and cared about justice against the oppression of the government. We could go through the whole 2,000 years for that. But there's also a tradition of Christian socialists against capitalism, just within the last 2 centuries. And it's yes, and I say that just because I know that some Christians think, like, they love to say the classic, I don't really care about politics, I just care about Jesus. When it's like
Jesus cared about politics.
Exactly. Where it's like to start caring about politics isn't as scary as they may seem to think. It doesn't. And I think they think of like big political activists they have in their head and think, that's what you want me to do? And it's like, no, there's basic little stuff that you could start. And there's a tradition of Christians doing this kind of stuff. And there are people who talk about starting in your workplace instead of like trying to find the most oppressed community and do whatever you can. It's like there's oppression going on in your day-to-day life around you. And I think that's like really important to talk about. And so now people are starting to notice a bit that people talking about rent strikes, people talking about striking from their workplace, people talking about a general strike. So I know you have said that you've gotten a lot more people messaging you lately about strikes and doing that. So how has that been? And what are some of the things that people are starting to notice? And what are some of the things people could start to do right now?
I have been getting a lot of messages we've been getting emails and DMs, and I get messages personally. My favorite thing in the entire world is when I get messages when people are like, I don't know how to do labor organizing, and I got a
Mm.
friend who wants to start a trade union. Like, are you
Yeah, that's
interested?
cool.
Would you help them? I think you know this, and I'm like, hell yeah, tell them to DM me or whatever. It's always really great. I like linking people together with that sort of a thing, and we've also been getting contact from people in our area as well. It's been really intense. I am doing my best to keep up with all of it, but my goodness, it's extremely exciting. And I think what's happening is this it's exactly what we were talking about earlier. There is a veil that is pulled over our eyes and that is reinforced not just by the world around us but by other people, by ourselves. Like the mechanisms and the power of the shit that we're dealing with in our contemporary moment is almost unknowable, which has been the problem. It's sort of the Fisher argument, right? Like sort of this idea of a capitalist realism means that the knowing of our contemporary moment is constantly in flux. That it is being incorporated and reincorporated and reincorporated and reincorporated into these new sort of like supposedly dominating historical discourses or moments or what have you. Like there's going to be like that this is how things are or whatever. But like when it comes down to it, it always takes a step that I think a lot of people don't have the toolkit to know what to do. Like, we're all treated like shit at work. I mean, come on, I make dog shit money and I work my ass off. And I've been like, okay, like, well, here's the example. Like, everyone told me to pull myself by my bootstraps growing up, and like, oh yeah, you should go to college because you're the smart guy in the family. No one in my family goes to college. Like, I was the first person in my family to go to college. I don't talk about it a lot, but like you're the smarty pants. You should go to school and you should go do that, and then you should go be a teacher or go do whatever you want to do, and that's what you should do. And when you do, you need to make sure you're working hard and you get plenty of jobs, and then you make a lot of money, and then you work hard at those jobs. You put your head down, you don't say anything, and you do everything within your power, and you will be successful. Well, I have a master's degree, I have $75,000 worth of student loan debt, and I've never made more than $35,000 a year. And that 6 months where I was making a $35,000 a year salary, I felt like the fucking king of Sheba. I mean, I have never had that kind of money. I've only been pinching pennies. All I've done is pinch pennies for my whole adult life. And even someone who was fairly left wing, I did not know where to go when it came to fighting for my rights in my workplace. Honestly, it felt as someone who like was interested in labor history and stuff. I was thinking, I'm like, that's the past, man.
Hmm.
Like, it's done. Like, we don't do this stuff anymore. Maybe eventually, like maybe at some point, maybe, but like maybe it will just happen. Maybe and then we look at these historical events and we think, wow, that's so powerful. I look at, the 1877 railroad strikes, for example, and I think, holy shit, that was crazy. It changed the way the entire railway industry worked in the United States. It really did. The Pullman strikes. I think about Seattle's general strike. I think about strikes a lot. Shocker. There's like, it was just this like historical like context combined with this like capitalist realism that just like I was someone who was left wing, someone who was from way too early of an age. I was annoyingly precocious in some ways, very supportive of trade unions and left wing ideologies, like someone who was very anti-war, someone who like I got into politics around that kind of like moveon.org, like anti-Iraq war stuff. And very quickly I learned that they're the fucking scrubs. Like, I'm like, oh, move on. That's lib shit. Like, let's do something cooler than that. Like, very quickly, I was proud of that. But what made me embarrassed in those moments is that I was not a historical agent. I have no agency. And I can really understand how I felt that way. One, because I was there. And two, because I know what it feels like to be that powerless. And I know what it feels like to feel like, well, this is how it has to be, I guess. And I know what it's like to feel like an absolute fucking failure because you cannot dig yourself out of the situation that you're in, no matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you try. I say all of this because the barrier between people, Christian, not like socialist, not working people, asserting themselves as historical agents is our ability to imagine it. We are not historical agents in our contemporary moment. We are passive figures. We have gone back to the history of great men. Now, great men run our lives. Great men and by great men, I really mean great markets and the markets that run them. The markets are supreme. It is the supremacy of our contemporary understanding of how just things economically are supposed to be or whatever. We have no imagination in our workplaces, and it used to break me. It broke my heart. I wanted to feel powerful. I wanted to feel like an agent. I wanted to feel like I could do something, but I just felt like a fucking speck. And most days I still feel like a fucking speck. I mean, in the division between me doing something about it was finally seeing someone else do this thing, was finally seeing, oh, someone's unionizing. How does that work exactly? And then you watch it, and then you set up a Google alert, and then you start following it on Twitter, and then you start retweeting it, and then you start reading about other strikes that were like it, and you start realizing this entire time you were watching TV when you were reading these books. You were watching a film when you were reading these books. You were presented with the sort of narrative that was, and then we examined it supposedly historically. By the way, if you're not like looking at history as something that's incorporated upon like a long scheme of, change, like various actors and changes and like constituting all of these different sort of changes in structure and individuals or whatever, not doing a very good job of looking at history. Because that's kind of the thing that they teach us in when you go to grad school for history is just like, guess what? You're going to specialize in one thing because we can't all know all of it. And, while that has its own problems, it was an honest assessment of like, I don't have knowing for me is not going to be the sum total of all the knowledge that I can find. Because I'll tell you what, I've been reading about a book a week for 20 years, and I don't have all the knowledge yet. And there's a lot of books out there, and I'm going to keep reading, but I don't think I'm going to be able to attain that. So how do I get to the point where I feel like I'm an historical agent? Event, other people doing something, and then you see and you say, I want to fucking do that. And then the next time that they have an event, you go and you show up, and these people say it's a strike, say it's a picket. It was for me. I showed up to the picket, and I showed up with a group of a whole bunch of volunteers, and they did something that is very common in activist circles. It's been around for a long time. I think the Rainbow Coalition did it when people used to get arrested and stuff. They all say together, and it makes me almost tear up every time I think about it. Thank you. We love you. Thank you. We love you. Thank you. We love you. This is what people say when people are released from jail from civil disobedience. This is what people say when you join them on the picket. Thank you. We love you. And in that moment, I'm like, whoa, this is a new love. Like, this is a new one. Yeah. I didn't know this. This is a new one. And that love, it was solidarity. It was working class solidarity. I didn't know it. I had been surrounded by working people my entire life who were all trying to claw their way into the middle class the best way that they could. Like who had just felt like I just don't have agency. And so I'm just going to do what I can and fuck the rest of it. And I'm just going to look out for me and my own. And we're just going to let that be that. And then love is this individual transactional thing that is an process of exchange between two parties. It's another, shocker. It's another fucking market. Love is a market. That was not a market. It was not conditional. The only condition was solidarity. And then the solidarity manifests it purely as a result, as an exercising and an outgrowth of one's being in that place, in that time. Thank you, we love you is a statement not just of gratitude, it's a statement of fucking power. And if you think love can be power, as I do, and not necessarily in that hippie bullshit way, and only partially in the way that Sailor Moon says it, then you understand that thank you, we love you, in an act of solidarity against the forces that oppress us is the powerful resurrection of this historical agency within me. I had done something that was an expression of love, and I didn't even fucking realize that I was doing it. How unbelievably powerful is that? I mean, holy shit. Whew, it's good. It's good stuff.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Yeah, it's funny. It makes me think. We need to add a fifth love to C.S. Lewis's Four Loves. It might fit into one of those, but who cares?
Yeah, who cares?
I wanted to wrap up too and talk about this quote from Rosa Luxemburg, and when she's critiquing the Russian Revolution, and particularly critiquing the way that terror was used, and she said, "Socialism in life demands a complete spiritual transformation in the masses degraded by centuries of bourgeois class rule." And when she says spiritual, of course, she's not necessarily meaning religious, but then the next sentence saying by spiritual meaning social instincts in place of egotistical ones,
yes.
mass initiative in place of inertia, idealism which conquers all suffering, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually what's funny is then the next sentence is, and Lenin knows this better than anyone, but he's not enacting it. But
yeah, it's in what is to be done. It's one of the principal sections of what is to be done against. He puts an argument against propaganda of the deed. Because he sees it as this, like, it's this individualized, improvisational, like, sort of action that does nothing to, like, in fact, can turn around and then make the state more powerful by turning other people who were previously maybe accepting to your ideas against you because they're afraid of you. Anyway, sorry. I love that correlation.
Exactly. And I feel like when I read about that, and also a great resource that everyone needs to check out is Rosa Luxemburg's essay "Socialism in the Churches," yes. which is written in 1905, seeing that she's leading these strikes and the priests are preaching against the strikes and the workers, and she then just goes throughout as a Jewish atheist, Rosa Luxemburg goes through the entirety of church history from Jesus all the way to now, all the ways, how radical they used to be, and then how each way they've sided with power through each economic system to make the larger point that Christians should be the first ones to care about what she's doing with the worker strikes. And so that's that whole essay. I think it's really amazing. But I read that and think about that quote, and for the non-religious people, I want to say that there is a spiritual element that is so important, and that we need a spiritual transformation that transforms our values deep within us in order to open up to a material revolution. And there are values that need to shift in order to get what needs to get done. And for the religious people who feel like they don't know how they'd fit into this space, especially because there's a lot of people that aren't religious at all, I would say that this is the natural progression from our faith, and that we do have a place within the leftist movement, and a large role that religious people can have in the larger movement is to work on those spiritual values and transform them in order to open ourselves up. And we have a long, rich tradition of that preaches solidarity that we can reach from and be inspired by and be empowered by and share that with others, not to make people Christian or to make a socialism with Christian tendencies or whatever, but rather use that love and solidarity and egalitarianism deep within our tradition to cultivate those values within the people around us. And I think that's like what socialism definitely demands, and a better future definitely demands. And so there's a lot of stuff that for us to do.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like, I think, clearly Rosa hits the nail on the head there. And the reason why Rosa was so, like, really understood this is because she was, like, in the shit, as we call it. Like, Rosa was like, I know we all talk about how cool Rosa Luxemburg is, but I want to make sure we all completely understand how cool Rosa Luxemburg was, and in particular because she was absolutely a woman of action. Holy shit, was she a woman of action? Oh my God. Like, it's unbelievable the steps that she took in order to continue to empower herself and then empower others as well. I have read her collection of letters. When it came out, I got super excited and I went over and I read it. And of more than anything, what I see from Rosa is a sense of being within herself that is ultimately incorporated unto other working people. And where her drive is coming from is the absolute need, not just a desire that has moved over into just like, it is a requirement for my nourishment, is to fundamentally confront the mechanisms that oppress the people who are in my life and oppress all working people. And a confrontation with those is going to sort of further not just our organizing project, not just the roles of workers, but is going to further human emancipation. And this is the idea of this, like, the idea is that like that Rosa and Karl Liebknecht and like moving up to the German Revolution and stuff, that they were preparing themselves for the most precipitous moment in history at that point, right? They were preparing themselves for an event that would cause a rupture in the most powerful system of economy that had ever existed and still has ever existed. After industrialism, everything changed, especially where people met and how they were. Like, and here's the thing. In terms of contextualizing certain elements of the New Testament within this, there are historical problems doing that, right? Like, in terms of an historical source, as sort of leveraging that in like an immediate, most applicable way can be kind of tricky, because we have about 2,000 years between ourselves and when the sources themselves were written. So I think society has changed a little bit. Also, capitalism didn't exist. So in terms of like when we frame the radical, at least for me, when I frame sort of radical elements that can be essentially extracted from Christianity, for me, it's less about those elements in and of themselves being radical, because they were incorporated into that period, incorporated into that time, extraordinarily radical. Now, is Paul's class analysis aligned with Marx? No, it's not, unfortunately, because Paul wanted to have the bougie fucks hanging out with their slaves and have everyone, being a powwow everywhere. And yeah. I'm sorry, Paul. No, I'm sorry. Like, you need to get those other people out. They come in. You start with the slaves. But that's just a disagreement that Paul and I have, and we have plenty. But I have the biggest love-hate relationship with Paul in the entire world. I've been studying him for so long that I hate him now, which is basically literally any historical subject. If you want to hate them, just study them for 5 years and write an undergrad and a master's thesis on them. However, what is viewable in Paul, and I truly believe this, like what we can extract from this is the way that a transition in terms of belief, because remember, Paul was a figure of transition, right? He started out in one very different life that turned into something that is, I don't know this for sure, but I would go out on a limb to say that the historical Paul was not walking around thinking about when a new Messiah was going to visit him and essentially gift him a new religious tradition that both rejects certain elements of Second Temple Judaism as well incorporates them into Greco-Roman traditions and then formulates them into this sort of new thing that also uses a very, very good, this is why Paul was good at what he did, a very, very good understanding of the people that you're talking to. When he was talking to Galatia, he knew the Galatians. When he was talking to Thessaloniki, he knew, or any of the people who wrote in Paul's name, or the non-canonical sort of like, Pauline epistles or whatever, like they understood that they lived in a time and a place. Historical figures did not say, how am I going to get up and demonstrate my historical agency today? That's the dumbest thing ever. No one has ever thought of that unless their head is so far up their ass, they're probably elected to public office in the United States. That is like it. Other than that's not how people see themselves. We don't see ourselves that way. We don't see ourselves incorporated that way. With Paul, he did see himself that way. And we need to take that from him. He was trying to give it to people. He really was. I don't know if the sort of like the demonstrations of his own historical agency and the own sort of like the sort of agency of human beings that we can read within Paul is the most radical thing I've ever seen. In fact, I would say that it's not the most radical thing that I've ever seen, but there is something absolutely incredible about the journey that Paul took. A very imperfect person throughout every aspect of his life who started in something so fundamentally removed that from what became, that what came didn't fucking exist yet. It came as the result of a powerful and completely changing, wait for the word, event that was the sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth, his crucifixion, his entombment, and then the fact that he rose again several days later. It was a fundamental rupture. And whether or not you see that as a spiritual rupture or a material rupture, personally, I think that's moot. Some people don't think that that's moot. They think it's worth talking about, or or that the point matters. Regardless of that, like spiritual or not, the imposition of the sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth sent a shockwave across the Western and non-Western world that really we haven't seen. Like, it was an absolute rupture. And what's so special about what happened to Paul is that at first you see yourself as incorporated into this is, has, and always shall be scheme of belief in people and ideas and stuff. And then one thing happens, and then all of a sudden, everything has changed. Every fucking thing. And if there's something that I can relate to Paul about, it's the second that I understood what matters the most in my life, outside of the usual, like, loving my husband and being good to him, and not in like a biblical way, like in like just being a good person and taking care of him because I love him, looking out for my dog because he has a lot of problems. And I get a lot out of taking care of an animal who has a whole lot of problems, like medical problems, to, take obligation for myself within my community and pick up my fucking cigarette butts or pick up after my dog, or like to not go on my porch and yell on the phone until 4:30 in the morning, not subtweeting someone in my building. Like there's all of these small little things that we can do to essentially like make ourselves part of a community, but none of those are rupturing an event that fundamentally reconstructs us until, for me at least, the class consciousness was no longer just something that I was sort of applying to my life, but when it moves forward toward you, as you move toward solidarity, solidarity moves back toward you. These are forces, they are gravitational forces that are pulling themselves together. Those who recognize the need to incorporate ourselves amongst a whole bunch of other people, and then to use that to exercise our power, rather than an individual trying to go out and, speaking of subtweeting, fuck you, Nietzsche, going out and asserting the own individual will to power. How somehow that's supposed to just make everything good. Well, I guess if you believe in like fundamental hierarchies, then yes, you would think that is good, but that's not how life works. What happens when solidarity stops just being a word and it becomes solidarity? There's something that I say a lot, and I'll end on it quite a bit. If I do a favor for somebody or whatever, I like to do things for people. It makes me happy. If I do something for someone and they say, wow, like you've been so generous, thank you so much, I say solidarity is solidarity. And it's because solidarity is, what I mean by that is that solidarity is less fluid, less movable, I think, than people think. And now we're in a period in terms of, sort of theorizing and all of this stuff where declaring like universalisms, hello Badiou, like is not in fashion. It is yucky. People do not like that. They would rather, like it's the Derrida idea that like the fundamentals of the binary between these two ideas presupposes their sort of complexity. If it's a binary, then the binary is already like, sort of setting up this sort of structure that is very easy to critique. Like, sorry, I'm big log rambling. What I mean is that solidarity is not, it's not a word. It's not an historical thing. It's not an easy it's not just an easy verb. It's not a verb that is incorporated into the rest of our life. The rest of our lives under neoliberalism is not about solidarity. We are pushed away from solidarity. Mm-hmm. Yet we find, in like times of crises, for example, I mean, yeah, I've seen plenty of people who are being giant dumbasses right now because I live in Florida. Guess what? Florida's about to be the next COVID like place because they refuse to close the beaches. And I see people going to the beach all the time. Disney didn't close, by the way, until Sunday this past week. So yeah, we're fucked. But anyways, like, if there's anything that you see in a crisis, it's how solidarity reaches up out from us and drives us towards people oftentimes. And we don't even fucking realize it. All we know is that I see somebody and they are hurting. They have a need. I can meet that need. And I am no longer creating false conditions that are really false conditions created by capital in my mind in order to justify me doing that thing. Doing it is the justification. And if that's the most like, if that's not the most anti-capitalist thing I've ever heard, then well, fuck, I don't know what I'm talking about then. But like at the end, like if doing the thing without the expectations for what happens after it, that's where the point for Christians comes in.
Yeah.
Faith and evangelism, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, is not transactional. This is not Kmart. Well, Kmart doesn't exist anymore. I used to say Kmart. This is not Target. You are not a cashier. You are not going in, like, you are not a cashier who is scanning a thing and giving it to someone and taking and say, now you have made your transaction. That is not how it works. I am so sorry that it is not that simple. And everyone seems to think like, oh yeah, you pray the Lord's Prayer. Dear Jesus, please come into my heart and make me a better person. I have sinned. And I pray for, I repent my sins and cha-ching, now you're good. Have a nice day. Here's your bag. Go outside. Like that is not in any way, shape, or form how human relationships work. And even Christians who do that kind of evangelism, they don't do it that way. Do you make someone a Christian and then just like push them out the door and say, see you later? No, right. Y'all are you're following up. You're making sure that they're coming to church. You're making sure that they're not doing all the stuff that they're not supposed to be doing. You're doing all the usual moralizing, the policing. Michel Foucault is appearing behind me. You know, like you're creating the structures of power and reinforcing them. Like that's really what's happening though in those circumstances. It is transactional, but no, like you do not. What you get has already been conferred to you when it comes to these situations. As if you're a Christian and you are using radical acts of generosity, you have already been conferred the benefit of this, because by the grace of God, you are who you are. And if you are what you are by the grace of God, you already have received the necessary qualifications to begin transforming your community around you, the people around you, not through a transaction. I evangelize, they become Christian, they come to church, but through the fidelity to event, through the fidelity to solidarity, because solidarity is not just a word. Solidarity is not a fucking river in Egypt. Solidarity is solidarity. It means so much more than people realize that I think we need to be theorizing about it more, because what does it mean in a sense of our ontology as a being, as a human, as a conscious person? What does it mean? What does solidarity mean? Like, what exactly does it mean? I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean, would you like to, have you accepted the Lord Jesus Christ into your heart? It's like, who's putting stuff in my heart? Like that's so, it's weird. But anyways, like all of this, why this matters is that we have to get that shit out of our heads that I'm gonna go get someone and I'm gonna get them to buy the thing and I'm gonna give them a receipt and then we're good. That is not what solidarity is. That is consumerism. That is fucking, it's honestly, it's nothing. It does not have real meaning. It has meaning only unto the structures that have created it and imbued it with meaning. You know what does have meaning? Solidarity has meaning, because you understand that you have already been conferred the benefit of the thing that you are seeking, which is grace, which is peace, which is which is to be a subject in the world. It's about understanding, right? People talk about finding themselves when they get saved or whatever, like rebirth and stuff. It's about finding identity. It's about subjectivity. Yeah. It's about psychoanalysis, really.
Yeah.
Like, and so if like our identity is fidelity to consumption into capital, then we will use solidarity as a model for consumption in capital. If our fidelity is to the event that disrupted and changed the pattern of human belief within those contexts so radically, not just in the Hegelian sense, which it did, which the spirit from top to bottom, all of a sudden we saw, oh, this is how we structured the world religiously. Now there's this new religious construction. We have to make something different out of this, and something's going to evolve out of it. Not just that, it's also in the fucking Marxian sense as well, where he takes Hegel's dialectic and he just turns it upside down. And he says, nope, we got to start at the material. Heaven, earth to heaven, not heaven to earth. Because where else are we going to start? And if that, to me, like fidelity to solidarity is seeing how our meaning and the evidence of our humanity is created not from top to bottom, but from the bottom up, and not individually, but as a group and all up. All of us, injury to one, injury to all, is like, it's a statement that describes solidarity so well, because it does. An injury to one means that an injury to all, and then an injury to one means an injury to all, and then the one pays the all back through a series of payments with interest that add up to the amount of work that person put in. No, like that's not it. You've already been conferred. The fidelity of the event is your fidelity to this event is manifested by the grace of God, which is you. It is what you are. It already happened. Fucking act like it. I don't know.
That's good. Yeah,
Sorry,
for sure. That's good. Thank you. Yeah, me and you have talked about the way, like, and you doing your content, talking about theory and labor history and video games and stuff, and me talking about Christian stuff. And we talk about like how it's like our content is starting to intersect. Mm-hmm. And initially, like when we said that like months ago, I made a joke that it would be because of Paul, but now I'm saying it's because of solidarity. That's the connector right there.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I feel both of us very much care about that a lot. And yeah, I feel like that's very important in what I'm trying to talk about and wake people up to and get people to open up to. So yeah, I appreciate you and everything you do, and make sure everybody go subscribe to laborkyle. The link is in the description, and on Twitch at laborkyle. I've been looking at Twitter.
I'm sorry, I can't find my phone.
It's okay. They're just saying that's a hot take, and someone else also not liking Paul. And Kay and Skittles, the last comment, we stand Rosa in this motherfucking chat.
Yo. Everyone watched it. Kay, they released a video with Radical Reviewer today, and it's really good. It's on bell hooks. And everyone should watch it. Bell hooks. I read Teaching to Transgress in college, and it changed my life. And I mean that sincerely. Also, it's a very good video. I watched the premiere. Okay, if you're still here. I don't know if you're still here.
Awesome. Okay. I'm actually going to probably go on Twitch right now. But
do it.
Yeah, so that's what I'm gonna do. Everybody who's in the chat right now, I'm gonna hop on. Let me post my link here. What are you gonna do? You want to hang out with me for a little bit on Twitch or what?
I may jump into your chat. Okay. I don't know. I can't decide what to do. I have stuff, but there's like 75 of them, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know which one, where. I don't know. I'll come chill. I'll come chill and chat.
All right, I'm gonna raid Who Is Damon on Twitch. As Dorian said, Damon raid Who Is Damon. Dorian also said, thank you, Damon and Kyle.
What's up,
more
Dorian?
On solidarity, please.
Yes.
So Dorian's all about it too.
Will do.
All right. See you later, everybody.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.